Okay, you might remember we are talking about, some features of planning goals and learning outcomes for an efficient language curriculum design. So, as we have already seen some advantages of the use of objectives and their limitations, and then we saw the competencies-based approach and their limitations. And then we looked at, the standards and their limitations. So the criticism on objectives, competencies, and the standards draw our attention towards the non-language outcomes and process objectives approach for planning planning goals and learning outcomes for a language course, right? So we're gonna see, we're gonna critically see what means by non-language outcomes and what are process objectives and their significance for planning goals and learning outcomes, right? Well, non-language outcomes, they typically, refer to other kinds of outcomes as compared to objectives, as compared to competencies and standards or benchmarks, okay? So they refer to some of the values which are very much related to the learners, okay, or the learner-centeredness, right? And these values are their social, psychological, or cultural needs. So the emphasis here is on basing goals or learning outcomes on the philosophy of social constructionism, to look at some of the individual variables and needs of the learners. This is what, and we saw social constructionism and its, tenets earlier on. Right. So non-language outcomes, there are different categories, but they've been divided into 8 broad categories. And just for the reference sake, much of the discussion is coming from Richard's book, Curriculum Development in Language Teaching. So these broad categories are about, the social, psychological, and emotional support. So, for example, if a teacher or if the curriculum has, clearly stated objectives or clearly stated competencies or clearly stated benchmarks or the standards, what about the support which learners might need in terms of their social or psychological well-being? So what about the element of confidence? So this non-language outcomes are the motivation, how this can be incorporated to the overall philosophy of language teaching. And what about the cultural understanding, right? To what extent students understand the culture of the natives, okay, and the community context where the language teaching going to take place, and the learning outcomes, right? And how to clarify the goals. I mean, how to, maintain a dialogue with the students to clarify the goals of the course, right? So these categories can be summed up, and we've got the employment element as well. So there are broad 8 categories of language curriculum, and these signify the importance of non-language outcomes. So overall, the process objectives within non-language outcomes should focus less on outcomes of learning. Rather, it should focus more on concepts and procedures. I mean, how to investigate a problem, how to assess a problem, I mean, this is what the emphasis in the non-language outcomes is, just to for planning goals and learning outcomes, just to prepare learners not to become outcome fixated, rather to know about their individual differences, their language wants, needs, and necessities. So in summary, non-language outcomes as compared to objectives and competencies and the benchmarks, they highlight the importance of non-language outcomes, which are the motivation, confidence, or psychosocial processes of language learning. So the whole philosophy here, the whole notion here is just to incorporate, if we incorporate these different dimensions into the language curriculum design while planning the goals and learning outcomes, the overall design can become efficient and can become more useful.